New York City, 1931. In the span of 14 months, 60 men are dead, shot in restaurants, gunned down in doorways, killed at card tables and barbershops and on street corners where they had stood 1,000 times before without incident. The bodies pile up so fast that the newspapers struggle to keep count. And when it is over, when the last body hits the floor and the last gun goes quiet, the most sophisticated criminal organization in American history rises from the wreckage. Not despite the war. Because of it. This is the story of the Castellamarese War, the bloodiest power struggle in the history of the American underworld. Two men, two visions of what organized crime in America should look like, 60 dead bodies between them, and a young man from Sicily who betrayed both of them, who would use their deaths to build something that has never been fully destroyed, something that is still running today. Picture this moment first. September 10th, 1931, 230 Park Avenue, Manhattan. The 9th floor of what will one day be called the Helmsley Building. A man sits behind his desk. He is 63 years old, well-dressed, well-educated, the most powerful organized crime figure in America. Four men walk in. They are dressed as accountants. They carry briefcases. They smile politely at the guards at the door and explain they are here for a scheduled meeting. The guards step aside. Inside the office, the four men pull weapons. What follows takes less than 2 minutes. When it is over, the most powerful man in the American underworld is dead on his office floor, shot, stabbed, lying in a pool of blood on the 9th floor of a midtown Manhattan building while the city moves below him without any idea what just happened. His name was Salvatore Maranzano, and 5 months earlier, he had declared himself the supreme ruler of every organized crime family in the United States. He lasted 154 days. But to understand why four men in accountant's clothing walked into his office and ended his reign, we have to go back 30 years, to a boy arriving in New York from Sicily, who would eventually decide that the entire American underworld needed to be rebuilt from scratch, and was willing to kill anyone who disagreed. Before there were 5 families, before there was a commission or a structure or anything resembling organized governance, there was chaos. Beautiful, profitable chaos. The Italian-American underworld of early 20th century New York was not a single organization. It was a collection of gangs, some Sicilian, some Calabrian, some Neapolitan, operating in overlapping territories, competing for the same rackets, occasionally cooperating and more often clashing. The most powerful of these early formations was the Morello Gang, based in East Harlem and the Lower East Side. Founded by Giuseppe Morello, a one-handed Sicilian immigrant who had arrived in 1892 and built the first real criminal organization in New York with both brains and brutality. The Morello Gang ran the Black Hand extortion rackets that terrorized Italian immigrant communities. They counterfeited money, they controlled prostitution and gambling and loan sharking in their territory. They were the first criminal organization in New York to operate with anything resembling a formal structure. But by the 1920s, the world had changed. Prohibition had arrived in 1920 and overnight transformed the economics of American crime. Every criminal enterprise in the country was now sitting next to an unlimited money machine, bootlegging. The illegal manufacture and distribution of alcohol in a country of 105 million people who had just been told they couldn't drink anymore. The demand was staggering. The profits were beyond anything the criminal world had ever seen. A case of liquor that cost $25 could sell for $1,000. And the men who understood this fastest, who moved into the bootlegging business with the most speed and the most organization, became the most powerful criminals in American history. 2 men rose above all others. The first was Giuseppe Masseria. The second was a man sent directly from Sicily to destroy him. Giuseppe Masseria arrived in New York in 1902. He was 16 years old. He was fleeing a murder charge in Italy. There was no extradition treaty between the two countries at the time, which made America a convenient destination for men with that particular kind of problem. He joined the Morello Gang, worked as an enforcer, committed burglaries, built his reputation through violence and reliability in equal measure. By the early 1920s, through a combination of murder, alliance, and the sheer force of personality, he had risen to become the most powerful Italian-American criminal in New York. He called himself Joe the Boss. It was not a modest title, but it was accurate. Masseria controlled more rackets than any other figure in the city. His bootlegging network supplied speakeasies across Manhattan and Brooklyn. His gambling operations ran from the Lower East Side to the Bronx. His protection rackets touched every Italian-owned business in his territory. By the late 1920s, he had become so dominant that other Sicilian bosses were paying him tribute. Not because they wanted to, because the alternative was worse. He was a man who had survived 2 separate assassination attempts, including one where gunmen chased him into a store on 2nd Avenue and fired so many shots that the entire block looked like a war zone. Police found him afterward sitting on his bed in his apartment, shell-shocked, his straw hat still on his head, with 2 bullet holes through it. The story of Joe Masseria surviving that attack became legend in the underworld. Men said he could dodge bullets. His reputation grew so large it became a kind of armor. But here's the thing about a man who calls himself the boss of everything. He makes enemies of everyone who wants to be boss. And in 1925, an enemy arrived from Sicily specifically to take everything he had built. His name was Salvatore Maranzano. He was born in 1886 in Castellammare del Golfo, a small coastal town in northwestern Sicily that would give its name to the war that destroyed him. As a young man, he had studied to become a Catholic priest. The theology remained with him, the discipline, the moral architecture, the belief in hierarchy and order. Even after he chose a very different vocation, he was obsessed with Julius Caesar, not casually, deeply. He read everything written about Caesar. He lectured his associates about Caesar's military strategies. He modeled his vision of criminal organization on the Roman military chain of command. Bosses, underbosses, captains, soldiers, a hierarchy so clear and so logical that anyone inside it knew exactly where they stood and exactly what was expected of them. His underworld associates called him Little Caesar. He did not find it amusing. In the late 1920s, his boss in Sicily, the powerful Don Vito Ferro, had decided it was time to extend Sicilian Mafia influence into America. He chose Maranzano as his instrument. His mission? Travel to New York, establish himself, and take control of Mafia operations from Giuseppe Masseria. Maranzano arrived with money, men, and a plan. He set himself up in Brooklyn, built a real estate business as a front, started running bootlegging operations, and began quietly building the coalition that would challenge Masseria's dominance. He gathered around him the men from Castellammare del Golfo and their allies. Joseph Bonanno, young, ambitious Castellammarese born, who would become one of the most significant figures in mob history. Stefano Magaddino, Joseph Profazzi, a faction of men bound by geography and loyalty. 2 giants, 2 visions, 2 men who could not exist in the same city without one of them dying. The only question was, which one? Here is where we need to stop, because neither Masseria nor Maranzano is the most important character in this story. The most important character arrived in New York in 1906. He was 8 years old. His name was Salvatore Lucania. His father was a sulfur miner from a small Sicilian town who had brought his family to America looking for something better. They found the Lower East Side of Manhattan. It was one of the most densely populated neighborhoods on Earth at the time. Tenement buildings packed so tightly together that sunlight barely reached the streets. Immigrants from Italy, Russia, Poland, Ireland, all compressed into a few square miles, all trying to survive in a city that had no particular interest in helping them do so. Young Salvatore Lucania looked at the Lower East Side and made a calculation. The men who had money, real money, weren't the men working in the factories and the garment shops. They were the men running the streets. The men collecting protection. The men who moved through the neighborhood with a kind of authority that nobody challenged. He was arrested for shoplifting at age 10. By 14, he had dropped out of school and was running his first protection racket, charging his schoolmates 10 cents a week to avoid getting beaten up on the way home. One Jewish boy refused to pay. His name was Meyer Lansky. Instead of beating him, Luciano was fascinated. A boy who didn't scare. A boy who looked back at him with something that wasn't fear. The two became partners, friends, a relationship that would last until Luciano's death. Through Lansky, he met Bugsy Siegel. Through the streets, he met Frank Costello. Through the criminal ecosystem of the Lower East Side, he met Vito Genovese, another Sicilian immigrant whose ambition matched his own. These were the Young Turks, the men who looked at the old Sicilian bosses and saw not power but limitation, men who refused to work with non-Italians, men who ran their organizations like personal fiefdoms rather than businesses, men who were so locked into the old world that they couldn't see the new world being built around them. Luciano could see it. He could see that the future of organized crime in America wasn't ethnic. It was corporate. It was about building structures that could generate money efficiently and protect themselves from law enforcement intelligently. It was about being a businessman, not a warlord. By the mid-1920s, Luciano was making millions from bootlegging. He lived in a penthouse at the Waldorf Towers under the name Charles Ross. He wore custom-made suits. He moved between the criminal world and the legitimate one with a fluency that most men in either world never achieved, and he had aligned himself with Joe Masseria, not out of loyalty, out of calculation. Masseria was powerful. Working for him was protection, access, resources. But Luciano was already watching, already waiting, already understanding that the war that was coming between Masseria and Maranzano was an opportunity that a smart man could exploit. He just needed to wait for the right moment. The Castellamarese War began not with a declaration, not with a meeting, not with any formal announcement of hostilities. It began with a betrayal inside Masseria's own faction. February 26, 1930, Gaetano Reina, boss of a Bronx-based gang, one of the men paying tribute to Masseria, shot dead on a street in the Bronx. The trigger was pulled on Masseria's orders. Here is the reason, and it reveals everything about how Joe the Boss thought. Reina had been secretly sympathetic to the Castellamarese faction. Masseria suspected it. Rather than confront him, rather than negotiate or test the loyalty, he had him killed. And he installed his own man in Reina's place. The calculation was simple. Remove a potential traitor. Install a loyalist. Strengthen the position. What actually happened was the opposite. Reina's men, who had been loyal to Reina personally, not to Masseria, were outraged. They didn't flip to Masseria's side. They flipped to Maranzano. Masseria had just handed his enemy a new faction by murdering the man who led it. The war that had been simmering for years erupted into open violence. The next months were a massacre. Men died on both sides, bosses, lieutenants, soldiers. But the momentum shifted against Masseria faster than anyone had predicted. August 15, 1930. Giuseppe Morello, Masseria's war chief, his strategic advisor, the man who had founded the original New York Mafia family, was shot dead at his East Harlem office. A visitor sitting across from him was killed at the same time, November 5, 1930. Alfred Manel and Steve Ferringo, two of Masseria's most important lieutenants, were shot dead simultaneously in the Bronx. Two of his top men, in one day, gone. The defection started immediately. Bosses who had been part of Masseria's coalition started making quiet contact with Maranzano. The mathematics of the war were changing. Backing a losing side in this world was not just embarrassing, it was fatal. And inside Masseria's inner circle, the Young Turks were watching all of it. Luciano, Genovese, Costello. They had been watching the war bleed Masseria dry, watching his power erode, watching the men around him lose faith. And they had been having a different conversation entirely. Here is the move that makes Lucky Luciano different from every other criminal figure in this story. While working for Masseria, he opened secret communications with Maranzano. He offered a deal. Luciano would arrange for Masseria to be murdered. In exchange, Maranzano would end the war. Luciano would receive Masseria's rackets. He would become the number 2 man in the new structure. Maranzano agreed. What neither man fully understood, or what Maranzano fatally underestimated, was that Luciano had no intention of being anyone's number 2. He was playing both men simultaneously, using the war to eliminate them both, setting up a structure where no single person could hold the kind of power that Masseria and Maranzano had each tried to accumulate. But first, the lunch. April 15th, 1931, Coney Island, the Nuova Villa Tamaro restaurant at 2715 West 15th Street. A Tuesday afternoon, Luciano invited Masseria to lunch. Just the two of them. Joe the Boss, the man who had survived 2 assassination attempts and was called the man who could dodge bullets, arrived without heavy security. He trusted his underboss completely. They ate well. Bread, wine, coffee. The kind of meal that a Sicilian takes seriously regardless of what is happening around him. After lunch, they played cards. At a certain point, Luciano excused himself to go to the bathroom. He was in there for approximately 5 minutes. 4 men walked into the dining room. Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, Joe Adonis, Bugsy Siegel. They shot Giuseppe Masseria 6 times. He died face down at the card table, reportedly clutching an ace of spades. The photograph of his body, sprawled across the white tablecloth, playing cards scattered around him, became one of the most iconic images in the history of American organized crime. Luciano emerged from the bathroom. He told police he had heard shots while washing his hands. Nobody believed him. Nobody could prove otherwise. Joe the Boss, the man who had dominated the New York underworld for a decade, was dead at 65, killed by the man he had trusted above everyone else. And the man who pulled him into the bathroom before the shooting started was now the most valuable ally the new boss of bosses had in New York. Maranzano moved quickly after Masseria's death. He called together several hundred mafiosi from New York and from other cities at a banquet hall in upstate New York. It was the largest gathering of organized crime figures in American history up to that point. He stood before them and reorganized the entire American underworld. 5 families in New York, each with its own boss, underboss, captains, soldiers, each with defined territory, each with specific rights and responsibilities. The structure modeled, as he had always imagined it would be, on the Roman military chain of command. The families were headed by Luciano, Tommy Gagliano, Joe Profaci, Vincent Mangano, and Maranzano himself. He gave them their territories, he gave them their rights. He gave them his vision of how the American Mafia should work. And then, at the end of the meeting, he announced one additional piece of the new structure. He was declaring himself Capo di tutti capi, boss of all bosses, above all 5 families, above the structure he had just described, a position that gave him supreme authority over every criminal operation in the country. The room went quiet, because most of the men sitting in it had understood that the whole point of ending the war was to eliminate the boss of bosses system. That was what Maranzano had promised. That was why so many of them had backed him. An end to tribute, an end to one man holding everything. He had promised to abolish the position, and then he had given it to himself. Luciano sat in that room and said nothing, but the calculation was already complete. Maranzano, for all his intelligence, for all his obsession with Caesar and Roman military structure, had made the same mistake as Masseria. He could not stop reaching for total power, and total power in this world was a target. The months between Masseria's death and Maranzano's were not peaceful. Maranzano moved to consolidate his position. He began whittling down the other family's rackets in favor of his own. He demanded tribute. He made enemies of the men who had backed him on the assumption that the tribute system was ending. And then, in the summer of 1931, he made a fatal miscalculation. He decided Luciano had to die. The reasoning was straightforward. Too independent, too connected, especially to Jewish gangsters like Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, whose involvement in the underworld Maranzano had always opposed on principle. A man like Luciano, Maranzano understood, would never fully submit to anyone's authority, which made him a threat. Maranzano hired a man to kill him, an Irish gangster named Vincent Mad Dog Call. Vicious, unpredictable, willing to kill anyone for the right price. He scheduled a meeting with Luciano at his Park Avenue office on September 10th. The plan was simple. Call would arrive at the office, kill Luciano when he walked in, clean, fast, final. But Luciano had a source inside Maranzano's organization, Tommy Lucchesi, one of the men who had survived the war, one of the new family bosses, told Luciano what was coming, that Maranzano was planning to kill him, that the meeting was a trap. Luciano moved first. On September 10th, 1931, the same day that Luciano was supposed to walk into Maranzano's office and be murdered, 4 men went there instead, Jewish associates of Meyer Lansky. Dressed as accountants, carrying briefcases, they told the guards at the door they had a scheduled appointment. The guards let them in. Inside Maranzano's office, they drew their weapons, disarmed the guards, and killed Salvatore Maranzano. Shot, stabbed, dead on the floor of his Park Avenue office. He had been the most powerful criminal in America for 154 days. As the 4 men fled down the stairs, they passed Vincent Mad Dog Call on his way up. On his way to the same office to kill Luciano, they told him there had been a raid, police. Call turned around and left. He never knew what had actually happened until it was too late to matter. Within weeks of Maranzano's death, Luciano called a meeting of his own, not in an upstate New York banquet hall, not a gathering of hundreds of men who could be photographed and identified. A quiet meeting, a working meeting, with the bosses who mattered. And he proposed something that neither Masseria nor Maranzano had ever considered. Not because they couldn't see it, because they couldn't let go of enough power to accept it. He proposed that nobody be the boss of all bosses. He proposed a commission, a governing body for the entire American underworld, 5 families in New York, plus representation from Chicago, Buffalo, and other cities. Each family with equal standing, each boss with a vote. Disputes settled through the commission rather than through violence. Murders of bosses requiring commission approval before proceeding. Democracy, criminal democracy, built entirely around the economic logic that internal wars were expensive, disruptive, and counterproductive. That the real enemy wasn't each other, it was the law. And the way to beat the law was to present a stable, organized, minimally violent front that didn't draw the kind of attention that 60 bodies in 14 months inevitably attracted. The bosses agreed. The five families of New York were formally established. The Luciano family, which would eventually become the Genovese family. The Mangano family, which would eventually become the Gambino family. The Gagliano family, which would eventually become the Lucchese family. The Profaci family, which would eventually become the Colombo family. The Maranzano family, which would eventually become the Bonanno family. 5 organizations, defined rights, a governing body to prevent the kind of war that had just killed 60 people and nearly destroyed everything. Lucky Luciano, the boy who had arrived from Sicily at age 8 and built his first protection racket at 14, had just invented the modern American Mafia. He was 33 years old. Here is what the war actually created. Not just 5 families, a system. A system so durable that nearly a century after Luciano drew the lines, those lines are still the map of organized crime in New York. The Gambino family became the most famous, and its obsession with fame would eventually destroy it. The Lucchese family became the quietest, embedding itself so deeply in legitimate industry that investigators spent decades just mapping the connections. The Colombo family became the most volatile, tearing itself apart in 3 separate civil wars while the government watched. The Bonanno family became the most infiltrated, its own boss eventually becoming a government witness. An FBI undercover agent embedded so deep inside it, he was nearly made a full member. And the Genovese family became the most powerful, the most disciplined, the most enduring, the one the FBI still considers the greatest criminal threat in the United States. 5 families, 5 different stories, 5 different fates, all of them born from the same 14 months of blood. Here is what the Castellamarese War actually proved. It proved that violence, on its own, solves nothing. Masseria was violent. He killed his way to the top of the underworld. He survived 2 assassination attempts and called himself the man who could dodge bullets. He died at a card table because his most trusted lieutenant left to go to the bathroom. Maranzano was intelligent. He had read Caesar. He understood hierarchy and military chain of command. He built the 5 families structure that Lucky Luciano would use for the rest of the century. He died on his office floor after 154 days at the top of the world he had just organized, because he couldn't stop reaching for power he had promised not to take. Both men failed for the same reason. They thought the point of organized crime was to be the most powerful man in the room. Luciano understood something different. The point was to build a room that kept generating money regardless of who was standing in it. Not a throne, a machine. And the machine he built in 1931, the Commission, the 5 families, the governing structure that turned criminal gangs into criminal corporations, is the reason that 94 years later, federal prosecutors in Manhattan are still filing indictments against men whose organizations trace directly back to the table where Lucky Luciano went to the bathroom while his boss was being shot. The war ended. The machine kept running. And somewhere in New York right now, in an office or a social club or a construction site or a waste hauling facility, the descendants of those 5 families are still doing exactly what Luciano designed them to do, generating money, quietly, invisibly, without drawing the kind of attention that 60 dead bodies in 14 months tends to attract. The Castellamarese War lasted 14 months. It killed 60 men. It ended with 2 of the most powerful criminals in American history dead within 5 months of each other, each killed by the same man, using the same method. Patience. Lucky Luciano didn't win the war by being stronger than Masseria or smarter than Maranzano. He won it by understanding something both men were constitutionally incapable of understanding. Power that requires constant violence to maintain is not power. It's exhaustion. Real power builds a structure, delegates authority, creates systems that generate money without requiring the man at the top to be personally present for every transaction, every threat, every murder. Real power looks like a corporation, with no name on the door. The 5 families that came out of the Castellamarese War built the most sophisticated criminal empire in American history, not because of their violence, though they were plenty violent, but because of their structure, the commission, the territories, the rules. Systems that survived the arrests, the convictions, the Rieco prosecutions, and the government takedowns that dismantled every other criminal organization the 20th century produced. 60 men died to build this machine. Millions of ordinary New Yorkers paid for it, in garbage bills and construction costs and fish market premiums and union dues and sports betting juice for the next 90 years. The war is over. The machine is not. But here is what you need to understand before we go any further. The 5 families aren't just 5 criminal organizations, they are 5 different systems, 5 different ways of generating power and money, 5 completely different stories of how an organization built in 1931 survived into the 21st century. Some of them adapted brilliantly. Some of them destroyed themselves from the inside. Some of them are still operating at significant capacity right now. And each one of them built their empire on a specific revenue stream, a specific industry, a specific corner of New York's economy that they made their own. The war gave them the territory. What they did with it, that's where the real story begins. The 5 families divided New York after the war, but the real power wasn't just who they were, it was what they owned. And what they owned will surprise you.